So as we see this all happening, let's talk about China.
Yeah.
There is a man who's the president of the United States who came in and he had, to put it lightly, some very radical ideas compared to the establishment. This is everything from the deglobalization. This is taking on China directly in all the trade. We'll call it talks if you want. Befriending dictators of enemies of the United States, and kind of playing up those relationships, to questioning very long-term relationships that the United States has, both on the diplomatic side, but also things like the World Health Organization, the Climate Accord, all these different things. Whenever there is something very disruptive like that, it's obviously going to be polarizing. So I don't want to get into kind of the political polarization that's well documented. But the one thing that in some weird world we've backed into, many of those policies are now going to be adopted, but the impetus for them is not going to be our president wants to do this. It's going to be the virus forced us to do this, right?
Yeah.
So the deglobalization. Now everyone wants to take on China. Both sides of the aisle are looking over there and saying, whoa, hold on a second, right? And it may be for some different reasons, but ultimately we get this showdown. And so, I spent a year in Iraq, a war that was started over WMDs that weren't there.
Yep.
And there's a lot of people, I think, that question that whole narrative of what, 18, 20 years later, why are we still at war in the Middle East? This is not a let's go invade, the largest population country in the world. This is let's engage in an economic war that 50+% of our country doesn't even understand, right? Yep. And so let's just start at a high level, how you see us positioned today, like that economic battlefield, if you will, like how is it positioned, and then where do we go?
Yeah. Lot to unpack on China. Trump ran for president on Make America Great Again. And like you said, again, back to the great accelerator, he was already making moves on China way before anybody ever said coronavirus. And you had the tariff wars, which were, a year ago, right, that those cranked up, and they came to this like pseudo deal that you knew that like the pseudo deal was really just, Trump was like, that's enough for my first term. And like, I'm definitely coming back at these guys in the second term. And a lot of this has been driven for Trump. A lot of this has been driven by Steve Bannon, right? That is the most hawkish guy that's closest to Trump. And Steve Bannon was out here the whole time with Kyle Bass and some of these other guys with a level of hawkishness that felt like it was kind of halfway to Alex Jones, right? And especially, it felt unpresidential in a way because Obama was such a, he really was a globalist, and he wanted everybody to get along. He's a big get along guy, right? And that felt, Obama was incredibly presidential, right? It's just, sometimes, politics aside, sometimes I see Trump get on TV and you really miss Obama, right? Regardless of policy decisions, but just like, Obama's a good guy, right? So with the globalization, Trump starts wanting to walk that back. Then here comes coronavirus. I'm of the opinion that it's becoming increasingly apparent that the United States is going to hold China accountable for coronavirus, and there's going to be a full uncovering of the facts. I have no doubt that the intelligence agencies, how much digging do you think the intelligence agencies have been doing over the last couple of months? Like, let's be honest. Let's just frame it like that, and we don't even have to answer the question. Just frame the question. they're going to answer for that. And then you're just starting to see the first things trickle in, right? Like what you said, World Health Organization. Okay. A number of other things. And then here comes the supply chain coming back. And the craziest thing, the experience for me personally that's been crazy is that, have you listened to Steve Bannon's podcast at all?
So I haven't listened to Steve Bannon, but before you tell us about this podcast, the one thing I will say about Steve and Kyle. So I did an episode with Kyle, went down to Texas and had lunch, and it was fantastic. Incredibly intelligent guy, right? Obviously. I left and I said, he really believes what he's saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was no doubt. There was no kind of anything. I didn't know anything about Steve Bannon before I went down there. We did not talk about Steve Bannon while I was there. Afterwards, I saw on Real Vision that Kyle interviewed Steve Bannon.
I watched that episode. Yeah.
And basically, you could sum up my understanding of Steve Bannon as headline, kind of coverage of him, right? Mm-hmm. So kind of he was the right-wing crazy guy that the media really kind of took some shots at. And that was, that's all I knew about him. Didn't know anything. After I listened to him and Kyle talk in that interview, I said, two things you can't argue with is Steve Bannon is incredibly intelligent.
Smart.
And Steve Bannon has a better pulse on the geopolitical landscape than pretty much almost anybody else I've heard talk about it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And he may be wrong. He may be right. He may be, ill-advised in one area. He may be kind of, waving his hand in other areas, whatever. But the dude is on top of a lot of stuff. Yep. And so I have not listened to the podcast, but I just want to put that out there as I was very surprised when I heard him talking on those two fronts.
Yeah. So the way that my China view has been formed really over the last probably like 5 weeks or so, at the beginning of April, I started listening to Steve Bannon's podcast. The guy goes 2 hours a day, like 6 days a week. It's like a lot of content, man. And again, it's like kind of halfway to Alex Jones. But I started noticing that he was talking about things that the United States was going to do on the podcast. And then like 10 days later, it would come true. Like Trump would do it. And you'd see some announcement, you'd see some move. And he had talked about, he called the pulling the funding from the World Health Organization, he called that a month before it happened. And he was talking about it factually. And so that was the first thing. And then I think in the second week of April, I saw Bill Maher say that we need to call this the China virus, and that we shouldn't be changing the nomenclature, whatever, of how viruses are named, just to try and be, not step on anybody's toes in China. Okay, this is not Kyle Bass saying this. This is deeply left, right? The champion of Bill Maher, right? And then I started thinking about it, and you start, this is what I meant at the beginning of this conversation, where you see how all these things are interconnected. Then you start thinking about the inflation thing. And then you start thinking about how the hell we're going to get, what are we need jobs. We really, really need jobs. And then you start thinking about the potential for behind closed doors, politicians on the conservative side rapidly arriving at the view that, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party is being treated as, really a bad actor. And we're treating them as a bad actor because there's now this body of evidence that shows that they're acting as a bad actor towards us. And it's not kinetic war, which was what we used to call war, like what you went to go do. But now they're talking about the economic war and the information war. And you're increasingly seeing this mounting body of evidence that is what's going on. And one of the main ways that I realized that it was going to get bipartisan support, after you think about inflation, which you need, and the job creation, which you need, was one of the main reasons that progressives were having a hard time getting on this Make America Great is because it feels xenophobic, right? Building a wall along the Mexico-Texas border feels very xenophobic. And progressives have definitely tried to paint some of the situations going on with China in a xenophobic type of manner, and I understand that. But what you're able to do is, this is not about the Chinese people. We love the Chinese people. This is not about Chinese Americans. We love Chinese Americans. This is about the Chinese Communist Party. We are fighting communism, and there is nothing more that Americans love than to fight communism. And when you can reframe it like that, is we actually want to free the Chinese people from the communist rule, and then you start getting these USSR lookalikes. And that picture, what Democrats how do you stand up to that? Oh no, I'm super, super pro-China because I don't like jobs for Americans in the worst economic downturn in American history, when unemployment rate is at unprecedented levels. Oh no, I don't want to bring jobs back to America. Nobody's going to take that stance. And now it doesn't have to be about xenophobia. And again, this is not my view. This is my observation of these pieces that have been laying in place. And the amount of, it was a little over a month ago that I think I kind of came to this realization, and the amount of dominoes that have started falling in this broad direction has given me pretty strong confidence that the United States is about to put the screws to China a bunch of different ways, and to a degree that I think just a really short amount of time ago would have thought is being impossible, and that we're going to see how strong the Chinese economy really is. I think when the United States really tries to start to punch back, I think, in against a lot of the different things that have been going on.